The cold wind rattled the glass doors of Maple and Pine Café that morning, making the soft chime above the entrance ring louder than usual. Inside, the warm air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked muffins. But beneath the cozy atmosphere, there was an unspoken tension that seemed to hum in the background. At table 7, an elderly disabled veteran, his army jacket faded and frayed from decades of wear, struggled to balance a tray of food on his lap. The squeak of his wheelchair was faint but steady as he tried to maneuver toward a corner table, his trembling hands clinging to the tray. He pushed forward slowly, but the uneven floor caught the wheel just enough to throw him off balance. The tray tilted, and in an instant, his cup of hot coffee crashed to the floor, spilling dark liquid across the tiles. A few heads turned, but no one moved. Conversations continued, and the espresso machine hissed as if nothing had happened. That's when Maya Carter noticed him. At just 26, Maya had been working at the cafe for nearly a year, her soft brown eyes carrying the quiet resilience of someone who'd had to grow up far too fast. Without hesitation, she set down her notepad and rushed across the room, her sneakers squeaking as she crossed the polished floor. She crouched down beside him, her voice gentle, barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, sir," she said softly, her hand steady as she picked up the scattered napkins and balanced what remained of his food. "I've got you." The man's lined face, weathered by time and hardship, softened as he looked at her. He nodded slightly, his lips trembling, but said nothing. Maya carefully wiped the floor with practiced motions, then disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, returning with a fresh cup of coffee and a plate of food. She crouched down again, placing the cup into his shaky hands, and helped him settle into a comfortable corner where the sunlight streamed faintly through the frosted glass. As she adjusted his chair and made sure he was comfortable, she ignored the impatient stares of customers waiting for her attention. For Maya, this wasn't about efficiency, tips, or table turnover. This was about dignity. But just as she stood and turned to leave, a sharp, cutting voice sliced through the warm hum of the cafe. "Maya?" She froze mid-step, her chest tightening as she turned toward the counter where her manager, Mr. Reynolds, stood with his arms crossed and a glare that could chill boiling water. "We've talked about this," he said coldly, his voice loud enough for half the cafe to hear. "You're here to work tables, not play nurse." Maya blinked, confused by the harshness in his tone. "He just needed a little help," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "It took me 2 minutes." Reynolds' jaw flexed, his eyes narrowing as if her answer had offended him further. Without another word, he reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps and set it firmly on the counter between them. "A termination notice. We can't afford distractions," he said flatly. "You're done here?" For a moment, Maya just stood there, her heart pounding in her ears. The words didn't sink in at first. Fired. For helping a man who clearly couldn't manage alone. A ripple of murmurs spread across the cafe as customers began whispering to each other, their eyes darting between Maya, Reynolds, and the veteran. The old man, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, froze mid-motion. His hand trembled around the cup, and he looked up at her with guilt swimming in his tired eyes. "Miss, you didn't have to do that for me," he said softly, his voice breaking with shame. Maya swallowed hard, forcing a faint smile even as her throat tightened. "Somebody has to," she whispered back. She took off her apron slowly, folding it with care as though refusing to let Reynolds' decision strip her of her dignity. Without another word, she set it on the counter, her sneakers carrying her steadily toward the door, even as her chest burned with frustration and disbelief. As she stepped out into the biting winter air, the cold hit her cheeks like a slap, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. Inside, the cafe fell into a strange silence, the kind that lingers after something profoundly unfair happens, but no one knows what to say. Reynolds returned to the counter, muttering under his breath, while the veteran stared down at his coffee, his hands now motionless, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of helplessness. A young mother sitting near the window whispered something to her husband, who shook his head slowly. An older man by the door frowned deeply, muttering words no one could hear. Outside, Maya sat on the edge of the curb, hugging her knees as the December wind whipped around her. The cold air stung her lungs, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing too fast, replaying every moment over and over. She had been fired for doing the one thing her father had taught her never to compromise on, helping someone who needed it. And yet, as tears pricked the corners of her eyes, she had no idea that inside the cafe, a chain reaction had already begun. The veteran, his face lined with frustration and guilt, slowly reached for his phone. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his contacts, until he found a name. An old friend from a different lifetime. A man he hadn't called in years but trusted deeply. Within minutes, the quiet streets outside Maple and Pine Cafe would witness something no one expected. Unbeknownst to Reynolds, unbeknownst even to Maya, a storm was brewing, one that would arrive not with words, but with boots, uniforms, and a force of unshakable solidarity. Maya Carter wasn't just another waitress passing through temporary jobs. She carried stories stitched into her bones, memories that shaped every decision she made. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, life hadn't been easy. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, the one who got up early to make breakfast when her mother worked double shifts, and the one who helped her younger brother with homework while their baby sister cried in the background. Her father, Sergeant Daniel Carter, had served in the United States Marines for nearly 2 decades. To Maya, he had been larger than life, disciplined, brave, and deeply compassionate. He often said the same thing whenever she asked why he worked so hard for a country that didn't always seem fair. How we treat the most vulnerable says everything about who we are, Maya. Always stand on the side of dignity. But life had a way of cutting deep. Her father passed away when she was 17, and from that moment, she shouldered the weight of keeping her family afloat. She took on jobs wherever she could find them. Cashier, babysitter, retail clerk. But the cafe job felt different. It was steady, the tips were decent, and most importantly, it was flexible enough to let her take night classes at a local community college. Maya's dream wasn't to serve coffee forever. She wanted to be a nurse, someone who could help others the way her father once helped strangers on and off the battlefield. Every dollar from her paycheck went toward rent, groceries, and school. There was no safety net, no backup plan. Losing this job wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. That was what made Reynolds' cold dismissal sting so deeply. To him, Maya was a replaceable cog in his machine, someone measured by speed and efficiency, not humanity. But Reynolds didn't understand Maya's perspective. Or maybe he didn't care to. He ran Maple and Pine Cafe like a clock. Every second mattered, and employees were warned that slowing down service was unacceptable. Where Reynolds saw numbers and transactions, Maya saw people. That morning, when she saw the veteran struggling, she didn't hesitate, she didn't weigh his dignity against a coffee order. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, and she simply acted, and for that she was punished. Maya sat outside on the cold curb, her breath rising in little white clouds, clutching her folded apron in her lap. She tried to keep her composure, but her eyes burned as hot tears threatened to fall. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold but from the frustration clawing at her chest. What had the world come to, she thought, when helping someone in need cost you your livelihood? A few minutes later, the sound of squeaking wheels pulled her out of her spiraling thoughts. The veteran emerged from the cafe, his coat collar pulled tight against the winter wind. He maneuvered his wheelchair toward her, his face etched with lines of regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice rough, strained, as though the words were hard to push out. "I heard what happened. You lost your job because of me." Maya turned to face him, her expression soft but resolute. She shook her head slowly. "Don't you dare apologize?" She replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You didn't do anything wrong. You served this country. Helping you was the least I could do." The old man's lips trembled slightly, his eyes glassy under the pale winter sun. He hesitated, then reached into the front pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn phone, its case scratched and faded. "There's someone I need to call," he murmured, his thumb fumbling across the screen. Maya watched in silence, unsure what he meant, but there was a determination in his movements she couldn't ignore. He scrolled through his contacts until he stopped at a name saved under S. Jeet. Miller. Without hesitation, he pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "James Miller," the voice said. "It's Henry," the veteran replied softly, clearing his throat. "Henry Lawson. We served together in Kandahar. Listen, brother, I need your help." Miller paused. "Henry. Damn, it's been years. What's going on?" Henry glanced at Maya, who was staring down at the pavement, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. He lowered his voice but made sure the words carried weight. "A waitress here? Her name's Maya. Just lost her job. Fired. All because she stopped to help me when I dropped my tray. Because she treated me like a human being." The other end of the line was silent for a moment, then Miller's tone hardened. All traces of casual warmth gone. "What cafe?" "Maple and Pine. Downtown," Henry said, his voice cracking. "I'll be there," Miller replied sharply. "Give me 30 minutes. Henry ended the call, slipping the phone back into his jacket. He turned toward Maya, his weathered face softening. "I know it doesn't seem like it now, But what you did today matters, he said. You reminded me there are still good people out there. And trust me, Maya, good people aren't alone. She frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant, but before she could ask, Henry rolled back toward the cafe. Her chest tightened as confusion, sadness, and curiosity tangled inside her. Inside the cafe, Reynolds was pacing behind the counter, muttering under his breath, his shoulders stiff with irritation. A few customers were still whispering about what had just happened, some quietly shaking their heads at his decision, but no one said anything aloud. Reynolds liked control, and at that moment, he believed he had it. He had no idea what was coming. 30 minutes later, the hum of Maple and Pine Cafe would be interrupted by the steady, synchronized rhythm of boots striking hardwood floors. 6 Marines would walk through those glass doors, uniforms crisp, faces set, and voices unshaken. They weren't there for coffee. They were there for Maya. The bell above the cafe door chimed, a sound so ordinary that no one looked up at first. But then came another sound, the firm, synchronized thud of boots against the hardwood floor. The conversations died down instantly. 6 Marines in full uniform stepped into Maple and Pine Cafe, their presence commanding and unmissable. Heads turned. Forks froze midair. Even the espresso machine hissed quieter, as if sensing the weight of what was unfolding. At the front of the group stood Sergeant James Miller, a towering figure with a square jaw, close, cropped hair, and a steady gaze that could silence a room without a word. His polished boots glistened under the soft cafe lights, and the patches on his uniform bore scars of campaigns fought far from home. As he entered, the energy in the cafe shifted. It was no longer just a cozy coffee shop on a winter morning. It had become the stage for something larger, something no one inside would forget. Behind the counter, Reynolds straightened his posture, trying to mask the nervous twitch in his jaw. He grabbed a rag and pretended to wipe the counter, but his hand trembled slightly. The Marines moved with deliberate precision, their boots clicking against the floor as they formed a loose circle near the front. Miller stepped forward, closing the gap between himself and the counter, his voice calm but layered with unspoken authority. "Are you the manager?" he asked, his tone steady but sharp, the kind of voice that didn't invite evasion. Reynolds hesitated for a split second before answering. "Yeah, I'm Reynolds." "What's this about?" He tried to sound confident, but there was an edge to his voice, a faint quiver beneath the forced calm. Miller removed his cap and set it on the counter between them, locking eyes with Reynolds. "I'm here because one of my brothers called me. Henry Lawson, you remember him?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the veteran, who was sitting near the window, quietly sipping his coffee, his wheelchair parked neatly at his side. Reynolds' face paled, but he said nothing. "You fired a woman today?" Miller continued, his tone low and measured, each word carefully chosen. "You fired her for helping one of our own. A man who served this country, who put his life on the line." A murmur ran through the cafe as customers exchanged glances. One woman whispered softly to her husband, who shook his head in disbelief. Reynolds opened his mouth, his lips dry, and tried to explain himself. "Look, I run this place the way I see fit. Service time matters here." She slowed things down. Miller's jaw tightened. He leaned in slightly, resting both palms on the counter, his shadow falling across Reynolds' hands. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable force beneath it, like the rumble before a storm. "Service." Miller repeated, his gaze unblinking. "You want to talk about service. Henry Lawson lost his legs in Afghanistan serving you. He left pieces of himself on the other side of the world, so people like you could sit here and pour coffee without thinking twice. And you fired the one person in this room who showed him dignity." The room fell into heavy silence. The hum of the heater, the faint clinking of spoons, the distant sound of traffic outside, all of it faded into nothingness. Every pair of eyes in the cafe was now locked on Reynolds. At that moment, Henry Lawson wheeled himself forward, his hands trembling slightly as he positioned himself beside Miller. He looked straight at Reynolds, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of everything he had endured. "She didn't have to help me," Henry said softly. "She didn't know me. She didn't know me. But she saw me struggling, and she chose compassion over convenience. That's the kind of American I fought for. That's the kind of person we need more of." A young woman near the door wiped tears from her eyes. An older man wearing a veteran's cap placed his mug down gently, his expression solemn and proud. There was no anger in the room, only silence, raw and unfiltered, as everyone waited for Reynolds to respond. Reynolds swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. I didn't mean any disrespect to him," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Henry. I have policies here. Rules. Things have to run a certain way. A Miller straightened, his shoulders squared, his expression unyielding. Policies don't excuse stripping people of their humanity, he said firmly. What you did today wasn't just wrong. It sent a message. You told every person in this cafe that speed matters more than people, that profit matters more than dignity. But we're here to tell you, loud and clear, that's not acceptable. A tense pause stretched between them before Miller's voice dropped lower, his words deliberate and sharp. You've got two choices, Reynolds. Make this right, or make headlines. The threat wasn't shouted, it didn't have to be. It was quiet, grounded, and far more powerful because of it. Customers leaned forward slightly in their chairs, sensing that something important was about to happen. Reynolds' gaze flicked between the Marines, their unwavering expressions, and the sea of watching faces around the cafe. He wasn't just facing Miller now, he was facing a collective weight of morality and solidarity that filled every inch of the room. The tension was palpable, thick enough to feel in the chest, and Reynolds' hands shook as he gripped the rag tighter, knuckles white. Finally, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, as though the fight had left him. He exhaled sharply, his lips pressed together before he muttered, Let me think for a moment." Miller didn't move. Neither did the Marines behind him, their posture straight, silent, and unyielding. No one in the cafe spoke, not even Henry, who stared quietly at Reynolds, his expression unreadable. In that fragile moment, everything hung in the balance. Whether Reynolds would do the right thing or double down on his pride wasn't just about Maya anymore. It had become a test of character. One man standing against the weight of a choice that would ripple far beyond the walls of Maple and Pine Cafe. And as the silence stretched longer, the air thick with expectation, one thing was clear: the next words Reynolds spoke would change everything. The cafe was so quiet you could hear the hum of the old heater struggling in the corner. Every eye in the room was locked on Reynolds, waiting for him to speak, waiting to see if he would cling to pride or choose compassion. He looked down at the rag in his hand, twisting it nervously, before finally setting it on the counter. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the moment. Slowly, he cleared his throat, his voice trembling just enough for everyone to hear. "Fine," he said, his words rough, reluctant. "She can have her job back." For a second, the air shifted, but Miller didn't move. He didn't blink. His jaw remained set, his gaze unwavering. Then, with quiet authority, he spoke again, his voice carrying like a stone skipping across still water. "No," Miller said firmly. "That's not enough." Reynolds' head jerked up, confusion flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean? She wanted her job back. I'm giving it to her." Miller leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the counter, his voice steady but sharper now, a quiet steel beneath the calm. "You embarrassed her. You humiliated her in front of a room full of strangers. You fired a woman who chose humanity over profit. If you want to make this right, you don't just hand her a job like a favor. You apologize. To her. In front of everyone." The murmurs started again among the customers. Some nodded in agreement, others folded their arms, waiting to see what Reynolds would do. For a moment, he stood frozen, caught between his pride and the mounting pressure around him. But then his gaze shifted, landing on Maya, who had just stepped back inside the cafe quietly, standing near the door with her coat still pulled tight around her. Her eyes were red but steady, her chin lifted despite everything. Reynolds swallowed hard, his face flushing as though the weight of every decision he had made was crashing down at once. He turned to face the room, clearing his throat before speaking, his voice cracking slightly on the first word. "I was wrong," he said, his gaze dropping for the briefest moment before finding Maya's again. "I made a mistake. Maya, I'm sorry." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was soft, lighter somehow, like the collective exhale of a room holding its breath too long. A few customers clapped quietly, and soon the sound grew louder, spreading until the entire cafe erupted into applause. Maya stood frozen, her hand gripping the strap of her bag tightly, her throat tight with emotion. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep her composure as tears threatened to spill. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about dignity, about being seen, about knowing that kindness still mattered in a world that often forgot. Miller motioned gently for her to come forward. As she approached the counter, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, placing it in her hands. "This," he said quietly, so only she could hear at first, "is from us. From the Veterans Support Fund. We heard about you, Maya. We know you're working toward nursing school. Use this. Finish what you started. The country needs more people like you." Maya's hands trembled as she looked down at the envelope, its weight heavier than its size. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, Finally, she managed a whisper, choked with emotion. Thank you so much." Before she could say more, Henry Lawson wheeled himself closer, placing his weathered hand gently over hers. His voice cracked with gratitude as he looked up at her. "No, Maya," he said softly, his eyes glistening with tears he didn't try to hide. "Thank you. You reminded me today that compassion still exists. You reminded me what I fought for." Her tears finally fell, slipping down her cheeks, as she nodded silently, gripping Henry's hand for a moment before releasing it. The cafe felt different now, lighter, warmer, united in a way none of the strangers inside could have predicted when they woke up that morning. Within hours, word of what happened spread beyond Maple and Pine's walls. A college student who'd been sitting in the corner posted a short video of the Marines confronting Reynolds. The clip exploded online. Within a day, hashtags praising Maya's act of kindness trended across social media. News anchors replayed her quiet bravery, her simple choice to help, and the wave of solidarity that followed. Local reporters reached out, eager to hear her side of the story, and within days, the cafe became a symbol of something much bigger than a single confrontation. It became a conversation about dignity, respect, and the quiet power of ordinary people choosing humanity when it matters most. But for Maya, the noise outside didn't change what mattered inside. Later that evening, when she finally sat alone in her small apartment, she opened the envelope Miller had given her. Inside was a check. More money than she had ever held in her life. Her hands trembled as she traced the numbers, her chest tight with gratitude. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that her dream of becoming a nurse wasn't slipping away, it was within reach. She set the check down and leaned back against her couch. Her father's words ringing in her mind, "How we treat the most vulnerable says everything about who we are." That day, she had acted on those words without thinking, without hesitation, and somehow the universe had answered. The next morning, Maya returned to Maple and Pine, not to work, but to meet Henry and Sergeant Miller for breakfast. As she walked up to the cafe, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden light across the street. Inside, she spotted Henry waving from his table, a wide smile on his face, despite the shadows of the past still etched into his features. Miller sat beside him, sipping coffee, his posture relaxed for the first time since they'd met. When Maya joined them, there were no speeches, no applause, no cameras, just three people sharing a quiet moment, bound together by the ripple effect of one small act of kindness. Sometimes, change doesn't happen with grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes, it starts with a simple choice to help, a quiet refusal to look away, and the courage to stand firm even when it costs you everything. Maya didn't just get her job back. She walked away with something far greater, the knowledge that empathy still mattered, that solidarity still had power, and that when people stand up for what's right, even the smallest act can spark something much bigger. As she left the cafe that morning, the air was crisp, and the city seemed quieter than usual. She paused on the sidewalk, looking back one last time at the glass doors that had become the backdrop of an unexpected story. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because she knew she wasn't alone. The Marines had come that day, yes, but they hadn't just walked in to confront a manager. They'd walked in to remind everyone watching, inside the cafe and far beyond, that kindness matters, and courage doesn't go unnoticed.